On a cold December night in 1773, Boston Harbor was quiet enough that you could hear the creak of ships' rigging and the slap of water against their hulls. Then, out of the darkness, a group of men in rough disguises climbed aboard 3 ships and with deliberate care began to destroy thousands of pounds of private property. They did not steal it, they did not keep it, they threw it into the sea. We remember this as the Boston Tea Party, but to understand why they did it, we have to open the broader file in the archive. A long, frustrating argument between a government trying to assert control and subjects who believed they were being quietly stripped of their rights. The road to the harbor. A decade before the Tea Party, the British Empire had just finished an expensive and bloody conflict. The 7 Years' War, whose North American theater is known as the French and Indian War. Britain won, but victory came with a staggering bill. Parliament looked across the Atlantic at the colonies and saw opportunity. The logic in London went something like this: we fought to defend these colonies. They prosper from British protection and trade. It's only fair they help pay the costs. So, in the 1760s, Britain began imposing new taxes and regulations on the American colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764, duties on sugar and molasses; the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards; the Townshend Acts of 1767, duties on imported goods like glass, paper, paint, and tea. From a purely financial perspective, these were modest, but politically, they were explosive. Colonists insisted they had the same rights as people in Britain: no taxation without representation. They had no representatives in Parliament, and they argued that only their own colonial assemblies had the right to tax them. So resistance grew: boycotts of British goods, protests, and sometimes violence. Under pressure, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, but left one tax in place: the tax on tea. That lingering tax was more than a revenue measure. It was a principle. Parliament was saying, we do have the right to tax you. The colonists were saying, no, you do not. Tea became the symbol of that clash. The Tea Act: cheaper tea, bigger problems. And then came the Tea Act of 1773, the British East India Company. A gigantic joint stock company that controlled much of Britain's trade in Asia was in financial trouble. Warehouses in Britain were filled with unsold tea, and the company was teetering. Parliament's solution was the Tea Act, which allowed the East India Company to ship tea directly to the American colonies, cutting out certain middlemen. Maintained the small tax on tea in the colonies. This actually made legal tea cheaper than smuggled tea. From London's viewpoint, it was clever. Colonists get cheaper tea. The East India Company gets rescued, and the principle of Parliament's right to tax is preserved. But many colonists saw something sinister in this arrangement. First, it looked like a monopoly being granted to a powerful company, one tied closely to the British state. Today, we might call it a bailout plus a corporate privilege rolled into one. Second, they worried this was a test. If they quietly accepted taxed tea now, Parliament might use the same method to extend taxes on many more goods. Third, the principle had unchanged. They were still being taxed by a body in which they had no representation. So, instead of being relieved by cheaper tea, a significant number of colonists were furious. Boston, a city on edge. Boston, in particular, was already a tinderbox. British troops had been stationed there to enforce order and the customs laws. In 1770, tensions had exploded in the Boston Massacre, when soldiers fired into a crowd and killed 5 civilians. Local leaders like Samuel Adams helped organize resistance through committees of correspondence, spreading news and arguments across the colonies. By late 1773, word spread that several ships loaded with East India Company tea were heading to colonial ports. In some cities, local pressure led merchants to refuse the tea or send ships back. Boston was different. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was determined not to back down. He insisted the tea be landed and the taxes paid. The law said that once the tea was unloaded, the tax had to be collected within a set time, or the cargo could be seized. So when the ship Dartmouth arrived in Boston Harbor in November 1773, followed by the Eleanor and the Beaver, the city entered a tense standoff. The ship's owners were stuck. If they unloaded, they'd trigger the tax and inflame the colonists. If they tried to leave without unloading, they risked punishment from the authorities. The governor refused to let the ships simply turn around and depart with their tea. Town meetings were held, crowds gathered. At least some of the men who would later take action met in back rooms and private homes, arguing over what to do. Boston's resistance leaders had been very effective at boycotts and protests, but now the question became, what happens when the usual tools fail? What happens when the law itself feels like a trap? The night of the Tea Party, the deadline for paying the tax on the Dartmouth's tea was nearing December 16, 1773. That day, hundreds, perhaps thousands of colonists gathered at the Old South Meeting House in Boston. Speakers denounced the Tea Act. Others debated what options remained. The tension was not theatrical, it was real. These were people weighing whether to defy imperial authority in a way that could have serious consequences. As evening fell, the meeting reached an impasse. The governor would not yield. The tea would not be sent back. Outside, Boston Harbor waited. On the water lay 3 ships, loaded with chests of East India Company tea. At some point that night, accounts differ on the exact phrasing. But the sentiment is clear. The meeting ended with a sense that words had been exhausted. A group of men, many associated with the Sons of Liberty, a resistance network, moved into action. Some loosely disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. This was less a serious attempt at anonymity and more a symbolic statement. They were declaring themselves something other than obedient British subjects. They boarded the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. Once aboard, they did something quite specific. They located the tea chests. They split them open with hatchets and tools. They dumped the tea into the harbor. They did not loot the ships. They actually deliberately avoided damaging other cargo or harming the crews. Some even swept the decks afterward. The destruction was targeted. The tea was the symbol and the message. In total, they destroyed 342 chests of tea, representing a significant financial loss, often estimated at what would today be millions of dollars worth. Imagine the scene: the cold air, the rhythmic crash of wood breaking, the growing stain of tea in the water, the smell of it drifting across the harbor as crate after crate went overboard. It wasn't called a tea party that night. That almost joking label came later, a bit of ironic understatement that stuck. How the British saw it: from London's point of view, this was not a principled protest. It was vandalism and rebellion, a direct assault on British property and authority. Imagine being a British official reading the report. A carefully designed parliamentary policy had been publicly humiliated. A powerful company, central to British global trade, had been attacked. Colonial subjects had openly defied the Crown in Parliament. The response was swift and harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of measures known in Britain as the Coercive Acts and in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. 1. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for. 2. The Massachusetts Government Act sharply reduced the power of the colonial legislature and increased royal control. 3. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried elsewhere, where authorities believed they'd get a more fair trial. 4. The Quartering Act expanded, allowed British troops to be housed more easily in the colonies. The message was clear: Boston would be punished. Disobedience would not be tolerated. But here is where history does one of its characteristic turns. From local protest to continental crisis. The British government likely hoped that making an example of Boston would isolate the radicals there and frighten other colonies into obedience. Instead, many colonists saw Boston's punishment as a warning of what might happen to any colony that challenged imperial policy. Sympathy and solidarity grew. Other colonies sent supplies to help Boston cope with its closed port. Political leaders who might have been cautious before began to worry that if Parliament could do this to Massachusetts, it could someday do the same to them. In 1774, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. That in itself was remarkable. A step toward collective action across colonies that had often acted separately. They condemned the intolerable acts, called for a boycott of British goods, built channels of communication that would prove crucial in the coming years. The Boston Tea Party, therefore, helped transform scattered grievances into a more unified continental resistance. Within 2 years, colonists would move from arguing about rights within the British Empire to declaring independence from it. Not everyone approved. It's important never to flatten the past into a simple good guys versus bad guys story. Not all colonists supported the Boston Tea Party. Some believed in resisting British policies, but opposed destroying private property. Others were loyal to Britain and saw the act as reckless and lawless. Even among those who disliked the Tea Act, there were people who questioned whether dumping the tea was a step too far. The American Revolution was not a story of unanimous agreement. It was filled with arguments, fractures, and uneasy alliances. The Tea Party sits right at that crossroads between legitimate protest and outright defiance, between law and conscience. Why the Boston Tea Party still matters? So what, exactly, makes the Boston Tea Party so memorable? A few threads stand out when we pull the event from its shelf in the archive. 1. It was about more than tea. Tea was the stage prop. The argument was about power, representation, and consent. Who gets to rule, and by what right? 2. It showed how symbols can ignite history. Tea was an everyday item, woven into social life. Turning that ordinary commodity into a site of political struggle made the conflict visible and personal. 3. It marked a point of no easy return. Once colonists were willing to destroy a valuable cargo, and once Britain responded with severe punishment, compromise became harder. Both sides felt their principles were at stake. 4. It helped push separate colonies toward unity. The punishment of Boston drew others into a shared cause. That sense of shared danger and shared purpose was crucial in the years leading to 1776. When you look back from today, the Boston Tea Party feels almost theatrical. Men in rough disguises, crates smashed open, tea pouring into black water. But underneath that vivid scene is a quieter, deeper struggle over ideas that still resonate: taxation and representation, protest and authority, order and justice. In the end, the Boston Tea Party was not just one dramatic night in a harbor. It was a turning of a page. Once that tea sank beneath the surface, the old relationship between Britain and its American colonies began to sink with it. And from those dark waters, a new and uncertain story began to rise.